I'm 47 years old. What happened to me 3 years ago at Whiskey Point happened in less than 10 minutes. I've spent every day since trying to understand those minutes. My name is Marcus Heller. I've worked in marine salvage for 22 years. I've recovered bodies, aircraft wreckage, and sunken vessels from depths that would kill most divers. I'm telling you this so you understand I'm not someone who panics in water or mistakes a seal for something else. On June 14, 2021, I followed something into the Pacific Ocean. I went under the surface and I saw what was waiting there. When I came back up, the world was exactly the same. But I wasn't. This isn't about whether you believe me. This is about what I saw when I crossed a threshold I can't uncross, and why I can never go back to seeing the ocean the way you do. I was at Whiskey Point because my equipment trailer needed repairs, and the shop in Port Alberni had kept it for 3 days. The job I'd been contracted for was postponed. I had time I don't usually have. Whiskey Point isn't a tourist beach. It's a stretch of rocky coastline 40 minutes north of Ucluelet, accessible only by a logging road that hasn't been maintained in a decade. The shore is basalt and driftwood. The water is always cold. I'd been there twice before, both times to recover debris from a fishing vessel that went down in 2015. I arrived at 6:47 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my phone when I parked. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see the water line from the road. I walked down with my thermos and a folding chair. I wasn't there to dive. I wasn't there to work. I was there because I wanted to sit somewhere no one would find me. The fog was beginning to lift when I saw it. It was 70, maybe 80 feet from shore. At first I registered it as a harbor seal. That was my brain's immediate classification. Dark head above the waterline, smooth movement. But harbor seals don't hold that position. They surface, breathe, and dive. This one stayed. I watched it for perhaps 20 seconds before I realized it was watching me back. That's when my categorization started to fail. The head was too large. The eyes, I couldn't see details at that distance, but I could see that they were forward-facing, predator eyes. Not on the sides of the head like a seal. The neck was too long, too flexible. When it turned slightly, the movement was wrong, too controlled, too deliberate. I stood up from my chair. The creature didn't startle. It maintained eye contact. Most strange sightings end here. The brain resolves the image into something familiar, or the subject disappears, or you blink and lose it. This didn't end. The creature held its position for another 10 seconds. Then it began to move parallel to the shore, slowly, still watching me. It wasn't swimming the way a seal swims. There was no bobbing, no visible effort. It glided. I followed along the shoreline. I didn't make the decision consciously. I just moved. It traveled perhaps 40 feet, maintaining the same distance from shore before it stopped again, still watching. I stopped too. Then it turned. Its shoulders came partially out of the water. I saw pale skin. I saw the curve of a spine. I saw arms, too long, too thin, reach forward into the water, and then it dove. Not the way a seal dives. There was no splash, no tail fluke breaking the surface. It simply descended, and I watched its shape grow darker as it went deeper until the silhouette disappeared into the kelp beds. I stood there, breathing hard. My hands were shaking. I was cold despite the wetsuit I wasn't wearing because I hadn't planned to go in the water. But I was going in the water. I walked back to my truck. I geared up. I tested my regulator. I checked my tank pressure. I did all of this with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has done it thousands of times. But my hands were still shaking. When I ask myself now why I made that choice, I don't have a clean answer. I'm trained to assess risk. I'm trained to never dive alone, never dive without a surface tender, never dive in unfamiliar waters without a survey. I've violated every protocol I've spent 2 decades following. But the truth is simpler and stranger than recklessness. I had been invited. The creature had not fled. It had led me along the shore, positioned itself, showed me its form, and descended slowly enough that I could track its path. Every action had been deliberate. It wanted me to follow. And I couldn't not follow. This is the part that people who haven't experienced something like this won't understand. The compulsion wasn't external. No voice in my head, no supernatural pull. It was the same feeling you get standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down. L'appel du vide, the call of the void. Except the void was calling me toward something instead of into nothing. I walked into the water at 7:34 a.m. I know because I logged it on. My dive computer out of habit. Surface temperature was 11 degrees Celsius. Visibility was 4 meters. I descended to where I'd last seen the creature's silhouette. The kelp forest started at 15 feet. Brown kelp, thick stalks rising from the rocks below. I moved through it carefully, controlling my breathing, scanning for movement. At 30 feet, the kelp thinned. The bottom was a slope of stone and sand. Visibility opened up to maybe 6 meters. That's when I saw it again. It was perched on a boulder 40 feet down, motionless, waiting. Its body was humanoid in the worst way, close enough to human that every deviation registered as wrong. The torso was too narrow, the arms too long, ending in hands with fingers that were twice the length of mine. The legs were bent beneath it, feet splayed against the rock. No fins, no tail, just limbs that looked almost right, but moved in ways that shouldn't be possible. The face, I couldn't look at it directly, not yet. My brain wasn't ready. It watched me descend. Then it pushed off the boulder and swam deeper, not away, deeper, and I followed. The first rule of diving is that you don't chase anything. You observe. You maintain neutral buoyancy. You conserve air. You respect your limits. I broke that rule immediately. The creature swam ahead of me with a motion I still can't adequately describe. It didn't kick. It didn't paddle. Its body undulated in a way that was efficient and alien, somewhere between an eel and a human swimmer, but precisely neither. Its arms moved in slow, sweeping arcs that seemed to shape the water rather than push through it. I followed at a distance of maybe 20 feet. My depth gauge read 50 feet, then 60. The light was dimming. My tank pressure was still good, 2,800 psi, but I was breathing faster than I should have been. It stopped again. We were at 70 feet now. The bottom had leveled into a field of stone and scattered boulders. The creature perched on one, half-crouched, its 2 long fingers curled over the rock's edge. It turned to face me fully. This time, I looked at its face. The eyes were the worst part. They were too large, not cartoonishly so, but enough that the proportions were wrong, black or dark enough that I couldn't distinguish the iris from the pupil. No visible whites. They were set in a face that had the basic architecture of human features, nose, mouth, cheekbones, but assembled with the wrong ratios. The nose was flat and wide. The mouth was too broad. The skin was pale, nearly gray, with a texture that looked smooth but somehow dense, like it had never seen sunlight. It watched me. I watched it. Neither of us moved. My mind was screaming at me to surface. The primal part of my brain that has kept humans alive for millennia was telling me I was in the presence of a predator. But the predator wasn't attacking. It was sitting, waiting. I held my position. My breathing was loud in my ears, too loud. I forced it slower, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The creature tilted its head. The movement was precise, controlled, almost bird-like. It was studying me. Then it did something I still can't explain rationally. It raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and placed it against its own chest. Palm flat, fingers splayed. It held the gesture for 3 seconds, then lowered the hand. It was showing me something, demonstrating something. I understood, not the meaning, but the intent. It was communicating. I raised my own hand and mirrored the gesture, palm against my chest. I held it for 3 seconds, then lowered it. The creature's mouth opened slightly. Not a threat display, something else. If I had to name it, I would call it recognition. Then it moved again, This time, it didn't swim ahead. It swam in a slow circle around me, maintaining a distance of about 15 feet. I rotated in place, keeping it in view. My heart rate was spiking. My air consumption was climbing. I had maybe 15 minutes of bottom time left at this depth before I'd need to begin a safety stop. The creature completed its circle and stopped in front of me again. Then it gestured, a slow sweep of one arm toward the deeper water beyond us. "Come with me." I should have surfaced. I should have ended the dive. Every instinct trained into me by 2 decades of professional diving was telling me to abort, but this wasn't a normal dive. I checked my gauges. 74 feet, 2,400 psi. I had time, not much, but enough. I nodded. The creature turned and swam deeper. The bottom sloped down sharply now, 80 feet, 90. The light was fading to a deep blue-gray. I switched on my dive light. The beam cut through the water and illuminated the creature's back, skin that looked almost translucent in the direct light, showing shadows of musculature and bone beneath. At 105 feet, the slope ended at the edge of what looked like a crevasse. The creature descended into it. I hesitated at the edge. My dive computer was flashing a warning. I was approaching the recreational dive limit. My air was at 2,000 pounds per square inch. If I went deeper, I'd need to extend my safety stop on the way up. But I went deeper. The crevasse was narrow, maybe 12 feet across, and the walls were smooth stone. I descended slowly, one hand trailing along the rock to control my position. My light beam showed the creature below me, still moving down. At 120 feet, the crevasse opened into a cavity. The creature stopped at the entrance and turned back to look at me. Then it swam inside. I followed it through. The cavity was larger than I expected, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling that arched overhead and walls that curved into shadows my light couldn't fully penetrate. But that wasn't what stopped my breathing. The walls were covered in marks, deliberate marks, carved marks, patterns of lines and circles and shapes I didn't recognize but knew immediately were not natural. They covered every surface, layered over each other in places, so dense that the underlying stone was barely visible. I swept my light across them slowly. The marks varied in depth and size. Some were crude, scratched shallowly. Others were precise, carved deep. They weren't random. There was organization, repetition. Sections that looked like they might be language or notation or something I didn't have a framework to understand. The creature swam to the far wall and placed its hand flat against one of the marked sections. It held the position for several seconds, then looked back at me. I moved closer. My light illuminated the marks beneath its hand, a series of curved lines surrounding a central circle. The pattern was repeated 3 times in a vertical column. The creature removed its hand and gestured toward the marking. I didn't know what it wanted me to understand, but I understood that this place was important. These marks were important. This wasn't a natural formation. This was made. This was used. My dive computer was flashing red now. I was at 127 feet. My air was at 1,600 pounds per square inch. I had 5, maybe 6 minutes before I needed to begin my ascent. The creature moved to the center of the cavity and stopped. It floated there, motionless, its eyes fixed on me. Then it pointed upward. The message was clear. Time to go. I nodded again. I took one last sweep of the space with my light, trying to memorize every detail. Then I turned toward the crevasse entrance. The creature followed me up, not ahead of me this time, behind me. It stayed close as I ascended through the narrow passage, close enough that when I glanced back, I could see its face clearly in my light beam. It was still watching me. We reached the crevasse edge at 105 feet. I began my ascent to 60 feet for a safety stop. The creature stopped rising at 80 feet. I looked down. It was hovering there, motionless. Its gaze still locked on mine. I raised my hand one more time, palm against my chest. The creature mirrored the gesture. Then it turned and disappeared back into the deep water. I completed my safety stop at 60 feet, then 15 feet, watching the water below me. It didn't return. At 11:22 a.m., I surfaced. The fog had fully lifted. The sun was bright. The water was calm. I swam to shore, removed my gear, and sat on the rocks for 30 minutes before I could stand. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, but everything else was different. He describes the moment not as a decision, but as a surrender. 1 second, he was standing on solid ground, water lapping at his ankles. The next, he was wading forward. He couldn't explain why then, and the years since haven't clarified it. There was no voice, no audible call, just an overwhelming certainty that he needed to follow, that turning away would mean missing something essential. Though essential to what, he had no idea. The creature had maintained eye contact for what felt like minutes, but was probably seconds. Then it turned, a fluid rotation that looked more like water itself moving than a body changing direction, and began swimming away. Not quickly. It moved with the casual pace of someone who knew they'd be followed. He stepped deeper. The cold hit his knees, then his thighs. Rational thought flickered at the edges. This is dangerous. The water is freezing. You don't know what that thing is. But the thoughts came from very far away, muffled and distant like sounds from another room. Closer, louder, more immediate was the pull, not a physical force dragging him forward, but an internal compulsion that felt almost like calm. That's what disturbed him most in retrospect. Not that he followed, but that following felt so peaceful. In ancient mythology, the sirens killed sailors not through violence, but through irresistible song. Men steered their ships into rocks, drowned themselves, willingly died with smiles on their faces because the call was too beautiful to resist. For centuries, scholars interpreted this as literal song, haunting melodies drifting over waves. But he wonders now if the siren's power was something else entirely, not sound, but direct communication with some deeper part of the brain that bypasses language and logic, the part that responds to the fundamental pull of the unknown. The French have a phrase for the inexplicable urge to jump when standing at a cliff's edge, l'appel du vide, the call of the void. Psychologists debate its origin. Some say it's a glitch in the brain's threat detection system. Others suggest it's a perverse test of self-control. Standing at that precipice, staring down at the drop, the urge arrives unbidden. Jump. Not because you want to die, but because the void itself seems to whisper an invitation to find out what falling feels like. What he experienced that day was l'appel du vide translated horizontally, the call of the deep, the ocean extending its invitation through a creature that should not exist, and some ancient part of his brain, older than civilization, older than language, accepting without consulting the parts of him that knew better. The water reached his chest. His breath shortened, the cold constricting his lungs. The creature was perhaps 15 feet ahead, just beneath the surface, visible as a pale shape against the darker blue below. It maintained that exact distance as he waded forward, never letting him get closer, but never swimming out of sight, leading him. The rhythm of the waves may have contributed to what happened next. There's research now, neuroscience studies on what they call the blue mind, showing that proximity to water induces a mild meditative state. The repetitive sound of waves, the shimmering light on the surface, the vastness and seeming timelessness of the ocean all combine to lower stress responses, quiet mental chatter, create feelings of awe and peace. It's why people sit on beaches to think, why coastal property commands premium prices, why the sound of rain or ocean waves helps people sleep. In normal circumstances, this mental state is beneficial. It's restoration, perspective, calm. But that same neurological shift, the quieting of the analytical mind, the opening to wonder, the reduction in threat perception, could also make someone more susceptible to doing something catastrophically unwise. The ocean was offering him a specific kind of peace, the peace of not having to decide, of letting something else guide him, of surrendering to awe and following where it led. The water reached his shoulders. He remembers the sensation of his feet lifting slightly off the sandy bottom with each swell, the buoyancy beginning to take over. The creature was now fully submerged, maybe 4 feet down, still maintaining that same careful distance, still watching him with those 2 large eyes. The next wave lifted him completely off the bottom, and instead of planting his feet again, instead of turning back toward shore, he took a breath and dove under. The cold hit his face like a physical blow. The world went silent, except for the muffled rush of water past his ears and the sudden loud pounding of his own heartbeat. The light shifted instantly, everything taking on that particular blue-green tint that exists only underwater. His eyes stung with salt, his vision blurred at the edges, but ahead of him, the creature's form remained clear. It had stopped swimming. It was facing him, suspended in the water column maybe 8 feet away, perfectly still, except for a slight movement of its hands, if they were hands, keeping it in place, waiting to see if he'd actually done it. The psychological literature on dissociative states describes moments when extreme stress or overwhelming awe can fracture normal consciousness. People report feeling like they're watching themselves from outside their body, or like they're acting in a dream where consequences feel distant and unreal. Trauma survivors describe it. Religious ecstatics describe it. Soldiers in combat describe it. He thinks now that he entered some version of that state, because even as his lungs began to ache, even as the cold started the long process of stealing heat from his core, even as every survival instinct should have been screaming at him to surface and swim for shore, he felt calm, detached, observing himself with curiosity more than fear. The creature tilted its head in what might have been recognition or acknowledgement. Then it turned again and swam deeper, descending at an angle away from shore. His lungs forced him up for air. He surfaced, gasped, felt the brief shock of cold air on his wet face, and dove again. The creature had waited, maintaining that same distance, and when he submerged it, resumed its descent. 3 times he surfaced for breath. 3 times he dove again to follow. Each time he went under, his body screamed with more urgency that this was wrong, dangerous, that he was swimming away from safety into deep water while following something he couldn't identify. Each time he ignored those warnings and followed anyway. On the 4th dive, he swam deeper than before, kicking hard to keep the creature in sight. As it descended, the light dimmed. The water grew colder. The pressure began to squeeze his skull, and the creature stopped at what he later estimated was about 12 feet down, hovering in that same uncanny stillness, and turned to face him. They hung there in the water, separated by perhaps 6 feet of cold Atlantic Ocean, and for the first time, he saw it clearly. The moment he passed fully beneath the surface, that final dive when he kicked deeper instead of turning back, the world didn't just change. It ended and began again as something else entirely. Sound collapsed inward. Above water, the ocean has a voice. Waves crash. Wind moves across the bar. Surface, gulls cry in the distance. Below, those sounds vanish. What remains is internal, the rush of water past your ears, the roar of your own heartbeat amplified and echoing inside your skull, the small clicking noises your jaw makes, the groan of pressure equalizing in your sinuses. You become the loudest thing in your environment. It's profoundly isolating. Vision transforms. Light bends at the water's surface, and what reaches you underwater is refracted, filtered, blue-shifted. Colors drain away in order, reds first, then oranges and yellows, until everything exists in a spectrum of blue and green. Distance becomes impossible to judge. Objects appear closer than they are. The water itself becomes visible as millions of suspended particles, each one catching and scattering light, creating a perpetual haze. You can't see clearly more than about 15 feet even in good conditions, and clarity itself becomes a relative term. Temperature becomes pressure, becomes environment. The cold isn't just a sensation on your skin, it surrounds you completely, equalizing across every exposed surface, finding its way into your wetsuit or clothes, drawing heat from your core with relentless efficiency. You don't shiver underwater the way you do in cold air. The water is too heavy for that. Instead, you feel your body slowing down, your thoughts becoming sluggish, your movements requiring more effort as the cold leaches energy from your muscles. And the pressure. Even at 12 feet, the water presses in from all directions simultaneously. It's not painful exactly, but it's present. A constant awareness that you're somewhere you don't belong, somewhere that is actively hostile to your continued existence. Your lungs compress slightly. Your sinuses ache. The water wants in. He had crossed from one world into another, and the crossing was total. Anthropologists describe liminal spaces, thresholds between states of being where normal rules don't apply. A doorway. The moment between waking and sleep. The edge of a forest. These are places where folklore insists the barriers between worlds grow thin, where creatures from one realm can slip into another. The shoreline is perhaps the most universal liminal space in human mythology. Every culture with access to water has stories about what waits at that boundary. But the surface of the ocean is an even more profound threshold. It's not symbolic or metaphorical. It's a literal division between two realms so different they might as well be different planets. Humans evolved in air, and we carry that environment with us in our lungs as a small bubble of atmosphere that sustains us. Water is fundamentally alien to us. We can visit it, but we cannot live in it. We are always, inescapably, visitors on borrowed time, measured in held breaths. He had crossed that threshold. He was in the alien realm now, in the creature's world rather than his own. The blue-green light wrapped around them both. The sound of his heartbeat filled his head. The cold worked its way deeper into his chest, and the creature that had led him here hung motionless in the water column 6 feet away, watching him with eyes too large for any face he recognized. Later, much later, he would try to explain to himself why he didn't panic in that moment. He was alone in deep water, far enough from shore that getting back would require sustained effort, following something he couldn't identify, with lungs already starting to burn and cold beginning to impair his coordination. Every objective factor said he should be terrified. But the terror was distant, muted, like the sounds from above the surface. What he felt instead was a strange hyper-awareness, every sense operating at maximum capacity, taking in details with preternatural clarity. The way the creature's hair, if it was hair, moved in the current as a single mass rather than individual strands. The faint luminescence in the water around them that might have been bioluminescent plankton disturbed by their movement. The way his own exhaled bubbles rose in a silvery column, breaking apart as they ascended toward the rippling mirror of the surface above. He was present in a way he'd never been present before. The moment had stripped away everything except immediate sensory experience. Past and future collapsed into a single extended now that contained only cold and blue light and pressure and the creature's unblinking gaze. Underwater, human faces are distorted by pressure and refraction. Our features become alien, eyes too large behind mask lenses, mouths stretched around regulators or pursed in unfamiliar expressions. We become strange to ourselves and each other. But the creature's face held its proportions underwater in a way that suggested it was designed for this environment, that this was its natural state. It didn't look wrong down here the way a human face would. It looked correct. And that correctness, that obvious belonging, in a place where he was desperately out of place, made it more unsettling rather than less. His lungs began to demand air with real urgency now. He had maybe 10 seconds before the demand became critical, maybe 20 before his body would override his intentions and force him to surface. Time was running out. The creature raised one hand. He still struggles with the terminology, but hand is close enough, and extended something toward him, not reaching for him exactly, offering something or pointing. And behind it, deeper in the blue haze where his vision started to fail, he saw movement, shapes, structures that didn't belong in empty water. His lungs forced the choice. He kicked upward, broke the surface, gasped air, felt the world snap back into sound and color. He spun in the water, orienting to shore, saw how far he'd drifted, too far. The beach was distant. The cold was already affecting his coordination. He had seconds to decide. Surface and swim for shore while he still could, or take another breath and go back down to see what the creature was trying to show him. He dove again. The water was murky. He remembers that specifically. Not the crystal-clear fantasy ocean of movies, but cold Pacific water with suspended sediment and the diffused light of an overcast afternoon filtering down through layers of green-brown opacity. His eyes stung from the salt, his ears filled with the internal rushing sound of submersion, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat. And through that murk, he saw it clearly. It was approximately 15 feet away, moving laterally through the water with a kind of propulsion that didn't match anything he'd seen marine mammals do, not the dolphin's rhythmic up and down motion, not the seal's paddle stroke. This was sinuous and continuous, like the movement of a ribbon caught in current, except the movement was self-generated and disturbingly controlled. The torso was humanoid. That word feels inadequate, but it's the closest descriptor. The shoulders, the posture, the way the upper body oriented itself, these were elements his brain recognized as person-shaped. But the proportions were wrong in ways that triggered immediate discomfort. The torso was elongated, compressed laterally as though evolution had streamlined it for hydrodynamic efficiency. The arms, he's certain they were arms, not fins, hung close to the body, ending in hands that seemed too long, the fingers webbed but articulated. Below the torso, the body transitioned, not the sharp fishtail of folklore, but something more gradual and more disturbing. The lower body tapered and flattened, developing what he can only describe as fluked extensions. The skin throughout this transition remained continuous, the same mottled gray-green that would render it nearly invisible against kelp or rocky substrate, but it was the face that unmade him. The concept of the uncanny valley describes the revulsion humans feel when confronted with something almost but not quite human. A corpse, a prosthetic that's too realistic, an android with slightly wrong facial proportions. Evolution wired us to recoil from these near-human entities, perhaps as protection against disease or genetic abnormality. What he saw underwater triggered that same primal alarm, but magnified beyond anything a rubber mask or CGI creation could produce, because this was real and alive and looking directly at him. The skull was elongated, the cranium higher and more domed than human anatomy allows. The nose was vestigial, barely more than slits. But the eyes were the feature that he still sees when he closes his own. They were enormous, far larger than human eyes relative to the face, and set slightly more lateral, giving a wider field of vision. The sclera was dark, not white, making the entire eye appear as one black, reflective surface. Like a seal's eyes, he thought at first, except that seal's eyes are soft, mammalian. These were not. These conveyed intelligence, not the simple awareness of an animal, but something that evaluated, considered, communicated. He describes it as the same quality you see in a person's eyes during conversation, the visible presence of thought happening behind them. Except these thoughts were occurring in a mind shaped by utterly different evolutionary pressures, in an entity whose cognitive architecture he couldn't begin to map. The mouth was lipless, a horizontal line that occasionally opened to reveal what might have been teeth or might have been something else. He didn't look long enough to be certain. He was transfixed by the eyes. The creature hovered in the water column approximately 10 feet below the surface. He had followed it deeper than he'd consciously realized. His lungs were beginning to burn. He'd entered the water on an unprepared breath with no inhalation technique, no mental preparation for how long he'd need to hold air. But the discomfort felt distant, disconnected from his attention, which remained locked on the being before him. It made no attempt to flee. That detail became significant later, during the years of obsessive analysis that followed. Marine mammals, even habituated ones, maintain a flight distance. Approach too close, and they retreat. But this creature had led him deeper, then stopped and turned to face him, as though the entire sequence had been deliberate, as though it had wanted him here. Around them the water was not empty. His peripheral vision registered movement, schools of fish that scattered in wrong directions, kelp that swayed without current, and shapes at the edge of visibility that his brain refused to resolve into identifiable forms. The seafloor below, perhaps another 15 feet down, appeared strangely textured, not the random scatter of rock and sand he expected, but formations that suggested pattern, straight edges where there shouldn't be straight edges, repetition where geology should be chaotic. His oxygen deprivation was becoming critical. The burning in his chest evolved into muscular convulsion, his diaphragm beginning the involuntary spasms that precede drowning. But the creature's eyes held his. Those massive, dark, intelligent eyes that reflected his own wavering silhouette on their glossy surface. Then it moved, not away, but closer. 3 powerful undulations brought it within arm's reach. This close, he could see the texture of its skin, not scaled, but not smooth like a dolphin's either. Something between, with a subtle pattern like dermal denticles. He could see the musculature moving beneath the surface, the slight flaring of the vestigial nose slits, the faint bioluminescent patterns along the creature's flanks that he hadn't noticed from a distance. Patterns that pulsed with light and colors his vocabulary has no names for, blues and greens outside the normal spectrum, photophores creating communication or display he couldn't interpret. It reached toward him, the hand, and it was a hand, jointed and fingered despite the webbing, extended slowly, not threatening, almost tentative. The gesture was so fundamentally human-like, so laden with the body language of approach and potential contact, that his mind screamed contradiction. This is not human. This moves like a person reaching to touch. He doesn't remember making the decision to surface. His body made it for him. Oxygen deprivation triggered automatic survival response, and he found himself kicking upward, away from the reaching hand, away from those eyes, breaking through the surface barrier and gasping air that hurt his throat. When he looked back down through the disturbed water, he saw nothing. The creature had vanished into opacity, but he knows it was still there, beneath him, watching his departure as deliberately as it had watched his approach. He had been permitted to leave. That's the thought that formed as he struggled back toward shore, limbs heavy and uncoordinated from cold and shock. This hadn't been an escape. This had been a dismissal, or perhaps the end of an introduction. The formations he saw on the seafloor haunt him more than the creature itself. That's what he tells people when he tells this story at all. The mermaid, he uses that word reluctantly for lack of better terminology, was singular, explicable as biological anomaly or unknown species. But what surrounded it suggested something far more unsettling. Infrastructure. He only saw it for seconds through murky water while his brain was oxygen-starved and his entire cognitive framework was collapsing under the weight of the impossible. His testimony on this aspect is compromised by physiology, and he knows it. But certain details persist with the crystalline clarity of traumatic memory, unchanged across decades of recollection. The rocks were wrong. He spent enough time exploring Pacific tide pools and coastlines to recognize natural geology. Wave. Action creates specific patterns of erosion. Tectonic activity produces certain formations. What he saw below resembled neither. The stones, dark basalt or similar volcanic rock, were arranged in repeating structures, not stacked but positioned, creating channels and chambers that water flowed through with visible purpose, directing current perhaps, creating pressure differentials, serving some function that natural formation couldn't account for. The arrangement reminded him, uncomfortably, of fish weirs, the ancient stone traps that indigenous peoples built in tidal zones to catch salmon and herring, V-shaped walls that guided fish into enclosures as the tide receded. Except these structures were fully submerged, oriented not for the intertidal zone, but for the permanently underwater environment, and they were far too large for human construction. Between the stone formations, fields of something grew. He hesitates to call it kelp, though it occupied the same ecological niche, vertical forests of photosynthetic growth anchored to substrate. But the motion was wrong. Kelp sways with current in passive, plant-like response. This vegetation moved with intention, fronds curling and uncurling in waves that traveled through the entire field like synchronized behavior, like a murmuration of starlings translated to flora. The bioluminescence was concentrated here, not the random scatter of dinoflagellate plankton that sometimes makes Pacific waves glow blue at night, but organized patterns. The light pulsed through the growth in visible waves, ripples of illumination that flowed from one section to another. Blues and greens primarily, but occasionally that other color, the one he can't name, that sits somewhere outside the range his eyes were designed to process. He knows how implausible this sounds. Bioluminescence is well documented in marine environments. Thousands of species produce light through chemical reactions. Firefly squid, crystal jellyfish, anglerfish, certain species of plankton and bacteria. But bioluminescence in shallow water, organized into patterns, responsive to presence, that crosses from documented phenomenon into something else. Deep-sea hydrothermal vents support entire ecosystems independent of sunlight. Tube worms, yeti crabs, species of bacteria that derive energy from chemical soup rather than photosynthesis. Life finds purchase in conditions that would seem hostile to biological processes. If complex ecosystems can thrive around superheated vents 2 miles down, why not in cold coastal shallows, hidden by murk and inattention? That's the rationalization he clings to, the scientific framework that makes the memory bearable. But rationalization fails when he remembers the shapes. Beyond the formations and the strange growth, at the very edge of his vision, where the water became too dark and particulate-laden to resolve detail, he saw movement, large movement, multiple entities far bigger than the creature he'd followed, drifting through the gloom like submarines running dark. He couldn't see them clearly, just the sense of mass, of displacement, of scale that dwarfed anything that should inhabit these waters. Gray whales migrate through this region. Humpbacks feed in these waters. He's seen whales from shore. What he glimpsed in that moment felt nothing like whales. The entire scene, the arranged stones, the synchronized vegetation, the organized light, the massive shadows, lasted no more than 15 or 20 seconds before oxygen deprivation forced him to surface. But those seconds contained enough strangeness to populate decades of nightmares and obsessive documentation. He's tried to find the location again. Multiple times over the years, he's returned to what he believes was the same stretch of coastline. The landmarks match, the particular configuration of rocks, the angle of the beach, the distant headland. But underwater visibility is never sufficient. The Pacific Northwest coast is perpetually turbid with runoff and sediment. What he saw required a specific combination of factors: water clarity, light angle, his exact position in the water column that he's never been able to replicate, or perhaps those formations aren't always there. That's the thought that comes to him at 3 in the morning, the idea he doesn't speak aloud. Perhaps what he saw exists in those waters only temporarily, seasonally. Or perhaps it's mobile, assembled and disassembled by inhabitants who've learned to avoid the attention of the species that dominates the land. The Pacific Ocean contains roughly 187 quintillion gallons of water. The volume is incomprehensible. And within that volume, human observation has touched only the most infinitesimal fraction. Submarines document trenches, sonar maps, topology. But the actual space between surface and floor, the cubic miles of water where something could exist undetected, that remains largely unknown. We've mapped Mars at higher resolution than our own ocean floor. We've sent more people to the moon than to the deepest parts of the sea. The Mariana Trench, the deepest known point in Earth's oceans, has been visited by humans exactly 3 times. 3. In the entire history of our species. What he saw wasn't in the Mariana Trench. It was in coastal water, probably less than 40 feet deep, within swimming distance of a public beach. If something that organized, that impossible, exists in shallow water frequented by kayakers and divers, what remains hidden in the depths that humans never touch? He researches marine biology now. Not professionally, he never changed careers, never pursued the formal education that might give him credibility. But he reads. He follows deep-sea exploration. He knows about the giant squid that were cryptozoological legend until 2004, when the first photographs proved them real. He knows about the frilled shark, a living fossil occasionally found in deep water, unchanged since the Cretaceous. He knows about the megamouth shark, unknown to science until 1976, despite growing to 15 feet in length. Large animals remain undiscovered. Complex animals with sophisticated behavior stay hidden in plain sight until the exact right moment of observation. If this is true for creatures that fit into existing taxonomic frameworks, why not for something genuinely outside our categorization? Something with tool use, social organization, intelligence, something that builds. He doesn't expect anyone to mount an expedition based on his testimony. He's not asking for validation. But the memory of those formations, those lights, those massive shapes in the darkness, that stays with him as vividly as the creature's eyes, perhaps more so. Because an unknown animal is one kind of mystery, an unknown civilization is something else entirely. The water broke around him as he surfaced. He gasped, not the smooth, controlled breath of a practiced swimmer, but the ragged, desperate inhalation of someone who'd forgotten they needed air. His lungs burned. The world above the surface felt too bright, too loud, the boundary between water and air suddenly harsh and unforgiving. He doesn't remember swimming back to shore. He remembers the feeling of sand under his hands, the shock of solidity after minutes of weightlessness. He remembers kneeling in the shallows, sea water streaming from his clothes, his body shaking, not entirely from cold. The beach was empty, the sun had barely moved. According to his waterlogged watch, he'd been in the water for 11 minutes. It felt like hours. It felt like no time at all. He sat there as his breathing steadied, as the adrenaline began to ebb, and tried to assemble what had just happened into something his mind could hold. The attempt failed immediately. Every time he tried to construct a coherent sequence, I saw it, I followed it, I went under, I saw... The narrative collapsed under its own impossibility. His first rational thought when it finally arrived was, I can't tell anyone about this, not because he feared disbelief, though that would come. The deeper problem was that he had no language for what he'd experienced. How do you describe intelligence in something that shouldn't be intelligent? How do you convey the weight of being observed by eyes that contained intention, awareness, thought? The words didn't exist. Any attempt to speak it would reduce the encounter to absurdity, a fish story, literally. He stood, legs unsteady, and walked to his car. He stripped off his soaked shirt in the parking area, found a towel in his trunk. The mundane actions felt surreal, a performance of normalcy over a foundation that had cracked. He drove home in silence. He showered. He ate dinner. He moved through the evening routine as if nothing had changed, while knowing that everything had. That night, he tried to write down what happened. He filled 3 pages before, stopping, staring at the inadequate words. On paper, it read like a fantasy, like something he'd invented. The flat prose couldn't capture the texture of it, the pressure of the water, the wrongness of the creature's proportions, the sensation of being acknowledged by something that existed outside all categories. He burned the pages in his kitchen sink. The isolation set in gradually, like cold water seeping through fabric. In the days that followed, he went to work, spoke with colleagues, maintained the architecture of his normal life. But there was a gulf now between him and everyone else, a chasm created by 11 minutes of experience that no one in his life could access or understand. He caught himself listening differently to conversations. When co-workers discussed their weekends, their minor dramas, and small observations, he felt the weight of what he carried, this enormous, reality-shattering thing, and the impossibility of ever setting it down in shared space. The gulf wasn't their failure to believe. It was deeper. They lacked the experiential framework to even comprehend what he would be claiming. He considered briefly seeking out others who reported strange encounters. He found forums, first-person accounts, communities built around the unexplained. But their stories felt different from his. Many seemed to want the attention, the validation of belief. Others had seen things for seconds, glimpsed movement in shadows. His encounter had been sustained, mutual, undeniable in a way that made these other accounts feel categorically distinct. He was alone with it. 3 weeks after the encounter, he returned to the beach. He's not entirely sure why. Perhaps he hoped the location would make it feel less dreamlike, more concrete. Perhaps some part of him expected to see it again, to have the choice of whether to follow presented a second time. The water was calm. The beach was empty. He stood at the tide line for an hour, scanning the surface, and saw nothing but ordinary ocean, waves, light, the occasional seabird. Walking away that day, he understood that the encounter was sealed in the past. Whatever had happened, whatever window had briefly opened, was closed. He was left only with the memory and the certainty that it had been real. The certainty became its own burden. If he'd had room to doubt, to convince himself over time that he'd hallucinated or misperceived, the experience might have faded into manageable strangeness. But the memory remained vivid, specific, resistant to revision. He knew what he'd seen. He knew the texture of the water, the exact shade of those eyes, the feeling of its attention on him. Knowledge without outlet is a particular kind of weight. It doesn't diminish with time. It accumulates. The astronauts who walked on the moon came back changed. Many reported a profound shift in perspective, the overview effect, after seeing Earth as a small, fragile sphere against the void. Some described difficulty readjusting to normal life, a sense that their experience had separated them from a humanity that could never understand what they'd witnessed firsthand. Our witness experienced something similar, but in reverse. Instead of looking down at Earth from space, he'd looked into an abyss that shouldn't contain intelligence, and found it looking back. The psychological term is anomalous experience integration failure. It occurs when someone undergoes an event so far outside their existing framework of reality that their mind cannot successfully incorporate it into their life narrative. The experience remains foreign, undigested, a splinter the psyche cannot absorb. For most people, reality operates within predictable boundaries. Unusual things happen, certainly, coincidences, moments of beauty or terror, but they occur within a world that fundamentally makes sense. The rules hold. The categories remain stable. He no longer lived in that world. The ocean had become something different to him. Not just water covering rock, not merely an ecosystem of fish and mammals and known biology, but a border, a threshold to somewhere else. Every time he saw waves, heard surf, smelled salt air, he was reminded that beneath the surface existed depths that could contain the impossible. This wasn't metaphorical unease. This was concrete knowledge, earned through direct experience. There are intelligences in the water that we have not categorized. There are ecologies we have not discovered. The world is larger and stranger than we pretend. That knowledge changed everything and nothing. His daily life continued unchanged. Same job, same routines, same obligations. But he moved through it now with a doubled awareness, living simultaneously in the mundane world of bills and traffic and weather, and in a larger world that contained mysteries his culture had relegated to mythology. The disconnection manifested in small ways: conversations about politics, entertainment, the usual concerns of modern life, began to feel distant to him, like transmissions from a place he no longer fully inhabited. Not because those things didn't matter, but because they rested on an unexamined assumption that we know what world we're living in, which he could no longer share. He found himself drawn to accounts of deep-sea exploration, reading about the creatures found in ocean trenches, the bizarre adaptations of life under crushing pressure and absolute darkness. Bioluminescent fish, gelatinous invertebrates, ecosystems clustered around hydrothermal vents, thriving in conditions that should be lifeless. These discoveries, remarkable as they were, only reinforced his certainty. If life that strange had been found, what remained undiscovered in the 80% of ocean we haven't explored? Science kept finding impossible things in the deep. Why was his encounter different in kind rather than degree? But he couldn't voice this argument, couldn't stand up in public and say, "I know there are intelligent humanoids in the water because I swam with one." The statement would end any credibility he had. The experience that had given him certainty had simultaneously imprisoned him in silence. He began to understand the isolation reported by deep-sea explorers and cave divers, people who'd been to places so removed from ordinary human experience that returning felt like coming back from another planet. They described the profound loneliness of having seen things no one else had seen, of carrying experiences that couldn't be translated into the language of surface life. James Cameron, after his solo dive to the Challenger Deep, the deepest point in the ocean, described feeling more isolated than astronauts in space. At least astronauts could look at Earth. In the trench, there was only darkness, pressure, and the knowledge that he was more remote from other humans than anyone in orbit. Our witness hadn't descended 7 miles, but he'd crossed a boundary just as absolute, and the return journey left him just as separated. The hardest part wasn't the memory itself. Memory, however strange, can be compartmentalized. The hardest part was living with altered perception, seeing the world through a lens that revealed how much we don't know, how thin the veneer of our understanding actually is, and being unable to share that sight with anyone. He considered therapy once, sat in the waiting room, imagined beginning to explain, and left before his name was called. What would he say? How could a therapist help him integrate an experience they would immediately try to explain away? He'd be offered frameworks: sleep paralysis, dissociative episode, stress-induced hallucination. The clinical language would reduce his encounter to pathology, treating his certainty as the problem rather than acknowledging what the certainty pointed toward. The culture had no space for his experience except as delusion or lie. That absence wasn't cruel, it was structural. Our collective worldview, our shared map of reality, didn't include intelligent beings in the ocean. To accept his account would require redrawing that map, and maps don't change for individual testimony, no matter how sincere, so he learned to carry it alone. The weight didn't crush him, but it never lightened. Years passed. He aged into the knowledge, built a life around the absence at its center, the thing he knew but could not speak, the experience that had marked him as permanently other. He still dreams about it sometimes, not nightmares. The encounter itself wasn't traumatic in that way. The dreams are quiet, vivid. He's underwater again, weightless, watching something move through blue space with impossible grace. In the dreams, he isn't afraid. He's just aware, cataloging details, trying to understand. He wakes from these dreams with the same feeling he had on the beach that day, the certainty of having crossed a threshold and the knowledge that he can never fully return. The witness anticipated the skepticism. He knows what the rational mind does when confronted with the impossible. It reaches for the nearest available explanation, however imperfect the fit. Marine biologists would suggest misidentification, a seal breaking the surface at an unusual angle, a manatee in waters where they shouldn't be, perhaps an oarfish, those serpentine creatures that occasionally rise from the deep. Columbus himself reported mermaids during his voyages, only for historians to later attribute the sightings to manatees viewed through exhaustion and expectation. The witness considered these explanations in the days that followed. He studied images of seals mid-breach, their bodies contorted by motion. He watched footage of manatees drifting through murky water. Nothing matched. The face had been too structured, the eyes too forward-facing, too aware, the movement too deliberate, too responsive to his presence. Marine. Mammals don't maintain sustained eye contact with humans. They don't pause mid-motion, as if inviting pursuit. Then there's the medical explanation: hypothermia-induced hallucination. Cold water triggers confusion within minutes. The brain, deprived of adequate blood flow, begins generating vivid sensory experiences indistinguishable from reality. But he wasn't in the water long enough. The sequence of events remained linear, detailed, coherent. Hypothermic hallucinations create fragmented memories, temporal gaps, dream logic narratives. His account contained none of these markers. Shallow water blackout offered another framework. Oxygen deprivation produces powerful visions in the seconds before consciousness fades. Perhaps he held his breath too long, began to black out, and his oxygen-starved brain conjured an impossible explanation for his own distress. Except he never lost consciousness. He remembers surfacing. He remembers the cold air hitting his face. He remembers choosing to go back under, following something that moved with intention through the water ahead of him. Every rational explanation requires dismissing his certainty, and his certainty is absolute. This creates its own kind of evidence. The witness's story is not an anomaly. It is a modern echo of something humanity has always known. The Babylonians called him Oans, a being who emerged from the ocean to teach civilization to early humans, half man, half fish, bridging two worlds. Greek sailors feared the sirens whose songs pulled men into the depths. West African traditions speak of Mamiwata, powerful water spirits appearing as beautiful humans with fish tails, capable of bestowing fortune or drowning those who disrespect them. Every coastal culture developed similar accounts. The details varied, but the archetype remained consistent: intelligent humanoid beings inhabiting the boundary between land and sea. These weren't dismissed as children's tales. They were warnings, treaties, explanations for the ocean's power over human fate. The witness unknowingly joined this tradition, and the ocean itself validates the possibility. Over 80% of Earth's oceans remain unmapped and unexplored. We possess more detailed topography of Mars than of our own ocean floor. The deep sea remains the largest wilderness on the planet, a three-dimensional realm of crushing pressure and absolute darkness where entirely alien ecosystems thrive. Every year, researchers discover species that shouldn't exist according to previous biological understanding. Creatures surviving near volcanic vents in conditions that would sterilize most known life. Bioluminescent organisms creating languages of light in the darkness. Massive formations on the seafloor suggesting structures too regular to be natural. The ocean keeps its secrets. In a world that feels completely mapped, completely explained, completely surveilled, this matters. The deep remains genuinely unknown, which means the impossible remains possible. The witness's story forces a single question that no amount of analysis can answer. What if he's telling the truth? What if something looked back at him from beneath the surface, something with intelligence and intention? What if the myths preserved a memory of something real, something that learned long ago to avoid human contact, to inhabit the spaces we cannot reach? The ocean stretches vast and indifferent, holding its silence. And in that silence, the question remains.